Hello and welcome to everyone listening to the Written in Melanin podcast, the place where you come to get your weekly dose of melanated creativity. I'm your host, CM Lockhart, an author of fantasy books featuring Black girls who aren't all that nice, and the owner of the Melanin Library, an online database of books written by Black authors. And in this space, I share with you everything I've learned on my journey as a Black and indie author. I'm glad you're here. And today, you guys, I am here with Antwan Floyd Sr., a distinguished author and publisher at Crime Fiction Media. He has written 18 novels and short stories that delve into the gritty world of mysteries and is best known for his Black Love series featuring a hard-boiled detective set amongst the backdrop of Chicago. And today, you guys, we are discussing crime fiction and his writing journey, and I'm really excited to have him on the podcast for the first episode of the new season. So welcome to the podcast, Antwan.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to have you here. So, before we get into all of this, the nitty-gritty details of crime fiction, please introduce yourself to our listeners, because you have 18 novels and short stories. When I read that, I was like, what? That's crazy. Talk about a career, a backlog.
Yeah. As she said, I am Antwan Floyd Sr. Yes, I have that many novels and short stories. I didn't always write in the crime fiction detective genre. I started off in I guess what they term as urban fiction, but I felt like it was kind of crowded, and so that's what made me shift, and I kind of fell in love with writing mysteries.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions for you, but I kind of want to touch on what you just said, talking about urban fiction, because I know a lot of our listeners are kind of like, okay, what is the difference between urban fiction and crime fiction? Because both of them are generally typically set in a very populated city, and there's usually something very, very bad going wrong. Can you clarify the distinction between those two for us?
Okay, now this is just my own personal opinion. I know I've heard a lot of different definitions of the two, but from my understanding, the distinction is when people talk about urban fiction, they're talking about, even though they're basically the same, to be honest, but when people talk about urban fiction, they're talking about stories that typically take place in Black neighborhoods. It's going to be a Black story. It's going to be something that's hood. You're gonna have the hot girl. You're gonna have the kingpin who trying to get out of the game. That's urban fiction. Very entertaining. When I think crime fiction, I'm thinking a detective type story. I'm thinking more along the lines of like a Walter Mosley or Easy Rawlins type character. That's what I think when I think crime fiction.
Okay. That makes sense. So basically, it's kind of what I thought the distinction between them was as well, because crime fiction is literally kind of what it sounds like. It's based around a crime happening, and it's usually like a detective or a police officer, because one of the books that I've read last year, 2022, was Blue Like Me. And I'm like, okay, this is very much crime fiction because it follows a police officer basically trying to right some of the wrongs that are happening in the city. And I think if you're listening to this, at least for me, based off of what you just said, Antwan, I'm thinking the distinction between the two for a lot of people is that crime fiction is usually above the law, right? In the sense of it's above board. You have, like you said, your detective, your police officer, somebody who works within the system trying to solve a problem. Whereas urban fiction, especially the subset of hood fiction, right? I didn't even know that was a thing until Instagram. I was like, oh, this is a whole genre. Okay.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time.
I just didn't know that's that was the actual subgenre. Or I think somebody was advertising their book talking about trap fiction. And someone was like, what's that? And I was like trap music, but a book. I don't know how to explain it to you other than that. And so that would be more so on the other side of things, where it's it's outside of the law.
But I don't know, because in my mind, it could have an anti-hero in crime fiction, or not even an anti-hero. He can just be downright on the other side of the law. Say for instance, say if Training Day was a book, that's a police procedural, but he was a crooked cop. So in my mind, that could still be a crime fiction type book, But if we want to muddy the waters, that can also be an urban fiction type book.
It sounds like they're just extremely interconnected. Like, you can't really talk about one without including the other in the conversation, essentially. So you said that you felt like it was too crowded, right? So what in your mind makes your books different in the sense of like when you were like, okay, this is cool, I like this space, but what was the trigger to be like, okay, I want to write something different than what I'm seeing in the genre? What led you to crime fiction?
Like I said, it was so many, because I first started doing this so long ago. There wasn't that many authors doing this. And then it seemed like overnight it popped up a lot of different authors writing these books. And like I said, they were all kind of like the same subject matter. And I've always been a fan of detective stuff, like all of it. I don't care what it is, really. I like Matlock. I like it all.
It back.
Yeah. I like it all. A Man Named Hawk, you know what I'm saying? I like it all. But my thing was, when I started looking for books, it wasn't as easy. I'm not gonna say it's not a lot out there, but it wasn't as easy to find the ones with black male-led characters. So
I understand that 100%.
Yeah, so that's what made me want to create my character, Black Love.
Okay. Honestly, I like his name because it's very, very clear, very straightforward.
Yeah.
So that being said, did you create your company, Crime Fiction Media, after that? After you decided to make that switch? Or because you decided to make that switch? Like, how did that come about? Tell us a little bit about that.
Because I made that switch. Because when I first began, I had a different company. It was called Bleeding Pen Publishing. And that's when I was doing all of my urban fiction and stuff. So I wanted to have a separate identity with the company. And being that I was writing the crime fiction, that's what made me switch over to that.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I would love to talk to you about that for just a little bit, because something that I've kind of noticed an influx of in the last couple of years is a lot more authors starting their own businesses and having their own like proper publishing for their books. So as someone who has done this, and like you said, before crime fiction, you had Bleeding Pen, you know, what was that process like being the author and the owner of the publishing house that was putting out your books?
I was nervous in the beginning because I was new to the computer stuff. So I've been doing it since like 2009. So I was new to the computer stuff. When I say computer stuff, I mean as far as hiring people, contracting people online and sending them money. So I was really nervous about that part. Like,
fair. Valid.
So I sent this person, I was getting book covers and stuff done and paying for barcodes and stuff like that. And I can't physically reach out and touch these people. So that made me hesitate for a little while. But I finally got over it. You know, I had to push the button and make it happen. But that was my first stage of doing it. I was nervous because everything was a first for me. But as time went by, I got more comfortable with it. It was easier for me to do it the second time because, you know, I had done it already. And the answers are out there. You know, they say we're in the information age. So the information is out there. If you want to learn it, you just got to pursue it.
Agreed. I am 100% believer. If you want to know something, there is an answer for it, because I've talked about this before, just the Melanin library. Part of the reason it exists is because I was like, oh, there's not a website that just has black authors? I'm so confused. Like, we are in the big age of 2020. What do y'all mean that there's not a website? Fine, I'll do it myself, right? But I can also say that for a lot of the things that I have done with the podcast and, you know, with Written in Melanin Publishing. And so it is such a process going from, okay, I just want to write books, because that's usually where it starts, right? Like, I want to do this thing. And then it grows into, okay, I want to do this better than what I've done it before. And then you look up and it's like, oh, I have a company. I have multiple companies. I've done this multiple times. I've learned so much since the first time that I've done this, because I think about all the time, like, how much I learned from my first book, Keeping Promises. And I'm like, I'm proud of that book, but I'm also like, let's not talk about that one, right? Let's talk about the new stuff.
Yeah, that's how I am about some of my first work.
And I think it's a natural progression of things. And it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm always reflective, I guess, but especially since, we're in January, it's the beginning of the year. What's something that you've taken with you thus far in your journey that you're like, man, I wish that I had known this when I started specifically about, starting your own company? Because I know a good handful of people who are listening to this right now, like, oh, I want to start my own company, but where do I start? Like, how do I go about this? Am I ready to take that plunge?
As I was listening to you talk, the main thing that was going through my head, because I was going back in my mind as far as when I first started and you were naming all your accomplishments, the main thing that popped in my head was hesitation. And it was never as hard as I thought. To just get started. I think that's one of my biggest regrets, that I did not just do it sooner. And I guess I wouldn't know because I didn't have the insight. But how you, once again, like you were naming your accomplishments, you're so busy doing it, you don't realize that you're racking up the accomplishments.
Agreed.
And that's the best part for me, because people, like I was just talking to my brother earlier today. He wants to write a book. He's been talking about writing a book for years now. My thing is, you just have to do it,
You gotta sit down and write the book.
Yeah, you just have to do it. And once you put in the work, all the work that you put in will speak for itself, basically what I'm trying to say. So the one thing I regret is not just doing it sooner.
I understand that 100%. Because I've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, right? But I definitely took some detours before I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just live in this space, in this lane that I know that I'm supposed to be in. And it's just kind of like, it takes a lot more courage than I think people usually talk about when they're on the other side of it, right? It's like, once you've taken the plunge, it's like, oh yeah, I just had to sit down and do it. But it's just like that moment when you make that decision and you're like, I'm gonna go all in on this. Slightly terrifying. And by slightly, I mean very, especially probably one of the most terrifying things you're going to do. But like you said, that hesitation is just that. It's hesitation. It's still something that if you're going to do it, you got to do it,
But you know what it comes with that terrifying feeling? That is a sense of vulnerability. Because you're putting yourself out there to be vulnerable to the world, to be rejected. And I think that's what paralyzes us sometimes. We have to learn how to let go of and embrace being vulnerable.
Yes, that. Because it's very easy to kind of see what other people are doing and just kind of wish you had it for yourself. Kind of like you said, the family members who will come up to you and be like, yeah, I'm writing a book. And you just kind of know in your mind how much time you've spent working on your craft and writing a book and marketing and creating a business. From the outside, it looks like, oh yeah, you just wrote a book. Like, oh, it's so easy. Like, you just made a cake. Like, no,
Yeah.
if you're gonna do this, it takes work, it takes effort. And like you said, you become vulnerable in a way because like your work is a part of you, and you're essentially just putting it out to the world. Like, hey, look at this. Because no matter how removed you are from your characters or your story, right? There are always going to be parts of you in the book that you can't remove, right? So I can only imagine what that's like when you're writing crime fiction and it's just like, okay, am I identifying with the protagonist or am I identifying with the problem?
I hear that a lot. People be like, is the main character you? I'm like, no, it's not me.
I think people enjoy the idea of inserting themselves into stories, and so they kind of believe that authors do that naturally, and including you. Like, pretty much every author I've ever talked to, they're like, no, it's not me, it's completely different aspects. Like, maybe one aspect of this character is similar to how I live my life, but the majority of it, no, this person's absolutely unhinged. Like, I like to think I'm a little bit more sane than that, But that being said, I kind of want to know what authors inspire you, because you touched on Walter Mosley, but like, how do I say this? Authors don't create in isolation, right? We have something that kind of spurs our creativity. And for a lot of us, we read in the genres that we ultimately end up writing in. So what are some of the books and authors who have inspired you to like do this and keep going? Because like I said, you got 5 books in this series, and a lot of authors don't make it past 2, being honest, in this indie industry.
So I like, my favorite authors are Walter Mosley, like I said before, and I like, my other favorite author is Eric Jerome Dickey. Those are
Okay.
my favorite 2 authors. But I read some of everybody. I'm right now reading this author. His name is Trace Conger. He writes detective books as well. I've read, those are my main ones. I read some of everything. A lot of books that I read though are indie published books. If I see somebody post something on Facebook or something, if I like the cover, I'm a cover person. If I like the cover, I'll just buy it because I want to show support.
I feel that.
And I go back and read some. Well, I go back and read just about all of them because I like to leave people reviews. That's another way I show support. But where I get my inspiration from is, like I said, like I like to read Walter Mosley when he drops something, or if it's another author I never heard of that wrote a detective novel, I will read those books. And I like watching a lot of detective stuff on TV. You know, like I said before. And I just get inspiration from everything. Like if I'm watching a show and it has really good writing, that will inspire me to want to write. Man, that was smart the way they went with that arc, you know, and that would get me motivated. I would turn the TV off and start writing, you know what I'm saying? So that's where I get my inspiration from.
I love that you touch on that because it is something that I don't know if it's a controversial opinion or not, but it's something that I personally like talking to authors about in general, about where they get their inspiration from, because I feel like a lot of authors are like, oh, I love to read. I was a reader first. And that's true for most of us, right? Not dismissing that. But I feel like when you're writing, you really start focusing on wanting to improve your writing and get better at it. You start looking at stories from other places. It's not just books, right? It becomes books, it becomes TV, it becomes movie. It can be like a random person telling a story on a train. It could be anything. And I said a train like we live somewhere with public transportation like that, but you know, whatever. You get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I get it from everywhere. Conversations, I eavesdrop. I get it from everywhere.
It comes from everywhere. And so I really like that you touched on that, because it's something that if someone's listening to this podcast, especially if they're like trying to break into that first book and trying to be like, I have an idea and I just don't know what to do with it, or I take in all of this stuff. I would always recommend like pay attention to the things that you are paying attention to. Like, what about this book or this story or this movie or this whatever is drawing your attention? Why do you like it? Why is it sticking with you? And then try to pull on that and add it to your writing and what it is that you're doing, because inspiration comes from everywhere. And I feel like, especially in this current age, that there needs to be more, I don't want to say diversity because that's not the word that I'm looking for, more differentiation in the stories that we are getting, because it is becoming, from my perspective, a lot of the same stories with a different cover, different skin, different author, but it's kind of the same thing underneath, right? That we're in need of some originality. And I always find it interesting because, you know, you mentioned reading a lot of indie books, and there are a lot more people reading indie books as compared to before, even when I started, and I'm still relatively new to this game. But there are a lot more people who are intentionally trying to read indie because they're realizing like, oh, this is something different. This is something good. And I guess I just have to ask you, when it comes to reading indie and reading traditionally published, have you noticed any type, especially within, you know, the genres that you frequent the most, have you noticed any, like, I'll say commonalities or shifts between the two over the last couple of years?
To be honest, no. I think because I view it through a different lens. I just look at, is it a good story? And I don't care if it's indie or if it's traditionally published, because I've read a lot of traditionally published books that are horrible.
Agree.
You know? So I just look at it through that lens. It's a good story, and that's all that really matters to me.
That's fair. That's fair. I don't know, maybe I'm too cynical, but I'm just kind of like, I guess that's because I've sat in on conversations on the internet where I don't participate. I'm just an observer of the drama. I don't like to actually participate in the drama, right? But I find it interesting because one of the things that come up a lot, especially on Book Talk, because that's, the big thing right now, is, people calling other content creators out, talking about, hey, you need to read indie books, and someone being like, hey, I want specifically this book. Like, where are all my books with specifically this thing? And people are like, you need to read indie because those things already exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that interesting, and it leading to like an influx. And I think it's also starting to shift how traditional publishing kind of markets their books and goes about things. So I'm always interested in how those two things work in tandem. But that does bring up the question of like, why did you decide to be indie? Because I know a lot of people, especially in the beginning, they kind of struggle with that first book. Like, do I want to try to query it? Do I want to get an agent? Do I want to like try to go through the machine? Or am I just going to do it myself? So like, what was your reasoning?
So like I said, when I first started, I was familiar with working with computers and stuff, but I wasn't utilizing the internet like I should. So when I first started, I did a lot of research. And when I compared A and B, A being traditional publishing versus B going indie, I didn't want to wait to get chosen. Going the traditional route. For those that might not know, you have to send in a query letter. I was trying to do this back before they were even accepting, so everybody doesn't do this, accepting query letters via email. You had to literally write them and mail them in and then wait. And all the stuff that I was reading, I was buying books. I read a great book called The Self-Publishing Manuscript by Dan Poynter. That book was great. I don't know if he still have any, I don't know if he have any new editions or not. But anyway, when I was reading that book, it was explaining how long you have to wait to get answers back, what to put in the letter, who to send them to, and if somebody ever responds, which could be 3 weeks to a month or longer, if they respond, they only want 3 chapters, then you got to send it back, then you got to wait again. I didn't want to do all of that waiting. First, you know what I'm saying? So the other option was B, going the self-publishing route. And that's when I learned about paying for my own ISBN number, hiring editors, Library of Congress and copyright and book covers and all of that stuff. I prefer to go that route because now I have more control in my own hands. I don't have to actually wait on somebody else because there's no guarantee that I might get chosen. Because not even just reading those books, I also learned that, and you're in this space, so you know, there's a huge difference and disparity in the publishing industry when it comes to Black authors versus everybody else. And they said, if you're just a regular, I ain't gonna say regular, I take that back. If you're not a Black author, it was a very hard to get chosen. But if you were a Black author trying to get a deal, your odds went down even more. So I didn't want to go that route and wait and hope. So I just did it on my own, being that the technology was there for me to do it.
I love that you touched on that because I feel like that's something that comes up a lot in this space, especially when you're in it and you start really paying attention to it. It's just kind of like exactly what you said. You have to make that choice between, am I going to do this myself or am I going to try to go through I don't say through the gatekeeper, but essentially if you're a Black author, that's what it is. Are you going to try to get past the gatekeeper? And some people do it, and there are a lot more people doing it, at least publicly. But that also comes with its own caveats. It's one of those things, like it's like 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other, right? It just depends which obstacle, which struggle you want to pick for yourself. Because if you go through the gatekeeper, and I'm talking specifically to Black authors for a moment, right? If you want to go through the gatekeeper, there's also the reality that, you know, there are not going to be a lot of people like you on the other side on every step of the journey, whether that be your editor, whether that be your agent, whether that be your cover artist, whether that be your marketing team, whoever. It is more unlikely, highly unlikely, that anyone on your team is going to look like you or have a similar cultural perspective that you have, right? But then if you do it yourself, I mean, you're doing it yourself. You're assuming a lot of responsibility, and you do have more control. And it is likely that your book is going to come out the way that you picture it, the way that you imagine it. But it does take a lot more work, and it does take more upfront investment and a little bit more of betting on yourself. And that can also be a really difficult thing, especially if you don't have the funds up front to invest into your book the way that you want to. So I think it's always interesting, especially as time goes on and we see more authors. I spend a lot of time in the young adult fiction genre, just because that's naturally where I end up. I don't know why. I've aged out of young adult. I know this, but that's still where I end up most of the time. But a lot of those authors are like, you know, they don't have the support that they hope that they did. There are some who are like, oh, I got really lucky. Like, I have a great team. But then there are some who are like, yeah, I have to do the legwork. I have to come up with the ideas. I have to do the marketing. I have to push the book. I have to organize all this myself. And I'm of the mindset personally, and y'all know if you're listening to the podcast and this is not your first episode, I'm a little bit of an anarchist, whatever. It's who I am. But if you have to do all the work yourself, you might as well just also make all the money yourself. But that's just me. That's just me and my thoughts. Do what is best for you, you know?
Makes sense.
But that being said, part of this whole process is writing a good book. Like, it doesn't matter who you query or if you're publishing it yourself or if you are trying to go traditional, you have to have a really solid book. And one of the things that kind of comes up in conversation a lot is this idea that all the good ideas have already been taken. And I'm very much of the mindset that, like, even if someone's done something before, you haven't done it. So, like, don't be pushed out of your lane thinking that somebody else is riding in it. But for you specifically, and for our listeners, because you are the first author who writes crime fiction that I've had on the podcast. So okay. I'm kind of curious what your perspective is of, like, how do you take something from your genre specifically where it's just like, it's a crime fiction, like something's going to happen, then your protagonist is going to have to essentially not solve the mystery, but essentially solve the problem. That's every book ever, but you get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. How do you put your own spin on that so it doesn't feel like you're giving the same book that people have already read a dozen times?
I don't know. I guess I never looked at it from that point of view. I look at it more along the lines of, and don't ask me what they are because I don't know, but they say there's only 5 stories and they're all recycled. You know, they're only 5 stories. So I look at it like that, and ideas just pop in my head, and I just try to put my own little twist on it. I know it's a story that's been told by somebody already, but I just try to put my own little twist on it. And I don't focus so much on the crimes or whatever the genre is. Like, let's just say it wasn't crime fiction. Let's say it was a romance or a sci-fi or something like that. I look at it from the human element of it. I want to tell the story about the characters. That's the main thing for me. Are these characters believable? Will people love them? Will people hate them? You know what I'm saying? Though, is the ending satisfying? Did this person do what they were supposed to do from A to Z? We're doing this. People don't want to look at it from this point of view because they just say authors and publishing companies and all that. But it is from an entrepreneurial place, right? Mm-hmm. So I seen something that somebody said, I forgot who it was, a book or something I read or a YouTube or something. But anyway, they talk about not opening a business on a block by yourself. And in my mind, I was thinking, why not? There's no competition. But they said it doesn't work that way because of the way the consumer minds works. They want to be where everything is happening at. They said that's why you see a McDonald's right across the street from a Burger King, right down the street from KFC. And across the street from KFC, you have Chick-fil-A. All of those people are going to congregate to that one area, and now they have choices. And KFC is not worried about losing customers to Chick-fil-A and vice versa, because they know everybody, they're all going to get some of that money. So that's the way I look at it as far as ideas. I just put those two together. Yes, I have the same ideas as some of these not ideas, but some of these storylines as someone who wrote detective novels or crime fiction novels 100 years ago. But I have to make my characters adapt to the world that we're in now, even though it's still just a murder mystery. So that's how I do mine.
I love that. And I love the example that you made, because I feel like that's the perfect example of how to think about it, honestly. And I know you're paraphrasing, but I'm paraphrasing your paraphrasing of the other thing. It's kind of like you said, I feel like KFC and Chick-fil-A are like two of the best examples, because it's just like both of them sell chicken, but they are completely different types of chicken, you know? And it's just like, yeah, they're both fast food. They're both going to hand you chicken out of a window, probably in a box, but it's just like, that's fine. Wait, Chick-fil-A doesn't have boxes. Don't give me the line. I don't go Chick-fil-A. But left or right, left or right, you know, you gonna get some chicken, some bread, and a lemonade out that window. It's gonna be completely different though. And I feel like as an author, you kind of have to accept that, okay, it's cool if Chick-fil-A is across the way. If somebody has a book about with the same premise, because it's just like I said, I live in the world of fantasy. So if y'all listen to the podcast, y'all understand where I'm coming from. But it's just like, I wrote a book about black assassins. Look, man, I am not the first person to ever think about that, ever. And I'm not the last person to ever write a story about that. But I can tell you right now that We Are the Origin and We Are Dying Gods are something that are uniquely themselves. It's not like, oh, this is just like, it's not though. It's not. And that's why it's like, people like the book, so just read it. Slight plug for myself and my own stuff. But while you're here and I have your attention, make sure that you guys check out the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, the description box below, so that you can get the links to Antwan's books. It's the first book in the series, the Black Love series, is Peacekeeper, and the most recent one to come out is The Detective and the Criminal, which you can see on screen. And I actually wanted to ask you about that as well. Is that the last book in the series, or just the most recent one?
That is the most recent one. Ideas just keep flowing to me. I have like 20 some ideas for the next stories that I want to write. I have spin-offs that are out right now from characters that were introduced in these books. So I'm trying to build my own little Black Love universe.
I love it. Because I feel like, especially authors who write series, they get that question so many times, like, oh, is there going to be a book about this particular character? And you're like, this character was on the page for like 3 pages and they never showed up again. What would you like me to do with this? You know? But it's very cool that you have like actual stories and novels that build out your characters that are introduced. Is that where your other short stories come from?
No, that was before I did so when I first started, I was doing my urban fiction books. I wrote 2 books. One of them was called Crew Love, and then Crew Love Part 2, The Black Mob. When I was kind of shifting away from that, I was trying to re-pivot myself, I suppose. So that's when I came out with my short stories. So I wanted to like get out of that genre a little bit, and that's why I wrote quick little short stories just to test the water.
I'm gonna say this, and if you guys caught the most recent episode of the Melanin chat, which is when we returned for season 5, y'all will have heard this already, but I'm going to say it again. If you are an author, the greatest thing that you can do for yourself is to work on your craft. So write your short stories, write your flash fiction, write your novels that may or may not see the light of day, but get better at what it is that you do. If you are an author, a professional one, then you have to write. I'm gonna say that, slight plug. If it doesn't apply to you, keep it moving. But returning to the conversation that we are having.
That was a great PSA.
I try to remind people, because I have been getting personally just a little frustrated with this idea that authors should be publishing the first thing that they ever write. Like, oh, you woke up on a Monday and we're like, oh, I'm going to be an author. You wrote something on a Tuesday, edited it on a Wednesday, and now it's ready to go out to the world on Thursday. And it's just kind of like, no, that's not how that works. Generally speaking, but I'm also the type of person where I'm like, if I'm going to do something, I like to do it well. And I feel like there is a growing number of authors who are like, if I'm going to do something, I'm just going to do it. And they leave off that well part. And then it becomes a thing of, you know, why don't people love me? Why are people not going crazy for my books? And I've kind of noticed that as well as just like within the Black author community specifically. And this idea that as Black authors, we should also be allowed mediocrity. And I am not that person. I'm the person where I'm like, instead of saying that we deserve to be able to be mediocre, I think everyone else should just be held to the same standard that we hold ourselves to. But that's a whole other conversation.
No, I like that. I like that. That sounded like a flex.
I mean, let's be real here. Like, because you touched on it a little bit without pretty much saying it exactly. But like, as a Black author, our chances of getting into traditional publishing are already tanked from the beginning. And it's just like, if you do want to get in, you have to be 10 times better. And we hear that our entire lives. It's like, you have to be, it's like your best has to be better than everyone else. Like, you have to try 10 times harder than everyone else for the same things that they have, right? It's just the reality of being Black in America. But it's also one of those things where I'm like, as we are taking up more space and creating more spaces for ourselves, I don't want to push this idea that we no longer have to be good at what we do. I want to push this idea that we are so good at what we do that they have to now match us instead of us trying to match them. Because I'm telling you right now, I don't want mediocre books. I hate to break it to you if you're listening to this and this hurts your feelings, and I suggest you take that to therapy and take it up with your Jesus, because a lot of these books that people be hyping up, they're not even good, y'all. They're not even good. The craft isn't there. The skill isn't there. And so much of it is pushed because the author is Black, or the author, they push the labor behind the book. And I'm like, okay, cute. You spent 10 years writing a book. I don't know, that whole 10 years, you never thought to write another book and get better at it? Like, learning experience. I don't know. It's like no one's publishing the book they start in second grade. There's a reason for that. Maybe if at 30, you shouldn't be publishing the book that you started at 17. If that's just me though. That's just me.
I get it. And to kind of backtrack on what you said as far as mediocrity and getting better and all of that, I am the perfect example of that, because I skipped those steps when I first started. I thought I did the research, but in my mind, just like everybody, a lot of people who I come across nowadays who say they want to be an author, I thought it wasn't important or it's no big deal. So I did not hire an editor. Put my stuff out, and it's still up. You can go back and read my old reviews for my first book, Crew Love. Review after review after review. It's a good story, but you should have paid some money and hired an editor. It's a good story, but the editing is bad. It's a good story. It looked like an 8th grader wrote this. I'm like, oh, God. Yes, they went in on me. But I don't know. I guess I thrive off of stuff like that. I'm like, okay, now I know that if you ever met a reader, people are serious about reading. Like, they do not play around. Like, readers are serious. They are, like, I put them right up there with what they call the beehive. They do not play the Bayhive. They do not play around. You know what I'm saying? So that made me want to get better at what I was doing, not just hiring an editor, but also get better at storytelling.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I guess makes me a little bit, I'm gonna say less forgiving, because that's not really how I feel, but it's kind of like, we live in the age of information, right? And I feel like it's one thing, because like you said, you started this 2009, right? That was before a lot of information was on the internet. Like you said, people were still sending in physical query letters at that point. And now most agents probably don't even know where their mailbox is in their office to go get a physical letter, right? You know, things have changed exponentially, right? Because 2009, Twitter was still brand new, wasn't even a year old, right? And now there are entire communities online on platforms that didn't exist that kind of decide the trend of what books are going to be popular, right? So things have definitely changed, and the information that's available has also changed, because it's kind of like I'm not going to pretend to know what kind of information was available in 2009. I was in 9th grade at that time. I wasn't even thinking about it, right? But I also know that in 2024, 2020, there's plenty of information available. And so it's just like, after a certain point, because the thing is, at this point, you can't even step into the author community without being bombarded with information. And like, these are the basic things that you kind of need to know. And there are so many avenues to get help and to get information and to be like how to start. When you sign up for KDP for the first time, they tell you and walk you through the steps of what you need. So there's really no reason to be like, oh, well, I didn't know. And I feel like that is the argument where in 2024, I'm just like, I'm not.
Yeah, I don't want to hear
What you mean you didn't know, bruh?
Yeah.
I'm confused.
And one of them you left off that I tell everybody, no matter what they're doing, you might have to sift through it, but YouTube University.
Yeah.
There's so many YouTube videos on there that will walk you through how to do just about everything. Yeah.
Literally everything from start to finish. And I'm just going to throw a slight plug in there. I have a YouTube channel as well that offers free information if you're into it, as well as, the podcast you're listening to. And I offer coaching services. If you ever want to talk to me, just throwing that out there. Slight plug.
I swear I need to get more like you. Just want to slide it in.
But that being said, I am very much a proponent of good writing. I'm a proponent of supporting Black authors. I'm a proponent of giving people a chance and giving books a chance, because it's just like, if you wait for the traditional publishing machine to acknowledge something, you're always going to be behind the curve. That's just a fact. So we are coming up on the end of our interview, though. So before we go, I have a couple of questions for you. The first being, can you actually tell our readers what the Black Love series is about? Because I know we talked about it. We talked about the first book. We talked about the most recent book. We talked about the whole genre. But what is this series itself actually about?
Black Love was a assistant district attorney from Chicago. In the first book, his ex gets sexually assaulted by the police. He goes from Chicago to Danville, Illinois to help out on the case. So it's basically like an origin story. So he did that. He didn't set out to be a detective, but it's just like one of those movie of the week things where it's like a fish out of water, so he solves the case. And by the end of the book, well, not even really the end of the book, I should say, by the second book, he's put in that situation where he needs to do the same thing again for somebody else. So he entertains the thought of becoming a detective, a private detective. He leaves law in that aspect as far as being a lawyer, and he becomes a private detective. In each book after that, and each spinoff after that, I just introduce new characters and help build out his world.
Okay. I like it. So, do you have to read the books in order, or are they kind of like standalones in that sense?
I would say, like, each story is its own individual story, but in some of the books, I might talk about other characters or an event that happened in another book, so you might be confused, like, what is he talking about right there? But I don't go heavily in depth into what happened in the previous book. But if you didn't read it, the other one, then you might not know who this character is that he briefly mentioned.
Okay, I got you. So it's recommended that you read it in order. Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay. So that being said, I have two questions. Well, that was the first one. So second question and this is what I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and that is, what writing advice would you give to any new authors starting out on their writing journey? And I know we've given a lot of advice throughout the entirety of this podcast, but one piece of specific advice, if you could be like, if you don't take nothing from this podcast, this is what I want to tell you.
Just finish. I have met so many, and I'm sure you have too, so many people over the years that say they write or want to write a book. You should write a book. I should write a book about my life. My life is so, yeah, okay. But just finish. I know it's easy. You get excited in the beginning and you get started, but you get distracted with life, and you know what I'm saying, you lose the motivation. But I say just take it back. What I tell people all the time is take it back to elementary school. When you first went to school, what did your teacher tell you? A story is a beginning, middle, and end. Start with that. Don't matter if it's good or bad, just finish, because it's a rough draft. They tell you that in elementary school. Just write a rough draft. So that's what I tell everybody. Just take it back to elementary school.
There you go. And I also support that thought, because especially your first book, the most important thing that you can do with your first book is to finish it, because it's very easy to start it and then like get halfway and be like, oh, you know, I don't think this is going to be the book, like the book. And y'all know what I'm talking about. And so you're like, oh, well, let me just start working on another one. Finish it. Like you said, get to the end and be like, okay, I've crossed this off. I know that I can finish a book. Now I can work on getting better at finishing the book, at writing the middle of the book, at starting the book, at catching attention. You can't work on your craft until you figure out what the craft is, right? Mm-hmm. And you need all three parts of it to write a book. You need the beginning, the middle, and the end.
And the end.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, but that is it. If you could let the people know where to find you, I will sign us off.
Okay. So, my website is www.crimefictionmedia.com. I'm on all social media. Just put in my name, Antwan Floyd Sr., across any social media platform, and I should pop up.
All right. Y'all heard the man. And as always, there will be links for everything in the place where you need to get them from. So go ahead and get into that. And that is it for this episode of the Written in Melanin podcast, you guys. If you'd like to support the podcast, then please share it with someone you think may enjoy it. Join the Patreon at patreon.com/written in melanin, or grab a copy of my books from my website, cmlockhart.com. There are links in the show notes and in the description box below for everything. And thank you guys so much again for listening. And until next time, I hope your days are lovely and your books are full of melanin. Bye, guys.